Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 59, with, of course, our co-host today, Tom Libby. How you doing, Tom?
Doing awesome. Happy to be here again.
And we're going to be covering today, as we go into the merry month of May, we're going to be covering today a book that is a meditation on the nature of decorum, which we don't often talk about in our culture anymore, politeness, appropriate conduct, and the misleading and ever-changing nature of that ever-deceptive human heart, Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Now, the version that I have that you can see on the video recording of this podcast was published by Arcturus Publishing and Arcturus Holdings Limited in 2022. So it's a little bit of an updated version of this book. Well, not updated version, but an updated edition of this book with a little bit of a different cover. It does clock in, Sense and Sensibility does clock in at 365 pages. So it is it's definitely a mid-level read. It'll take, if you're reading it through, take about a month if you're really clopping through to cover it. And of course, our podcast today acts as a accompaniment to the podcast that we did where we covered Jane Austen last year, and we talked about Dave Shepard's The Annotated Persuasion. So I'm going to open from Sense and Sensibility, chapter 1. We're going to start right at the beginning and get right into it. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large and their residence was at Norland Park, in the center of their property, where for many generations they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. The late owner of this estate was a single man who lived to a very advanced age and who for many years of his life had a constant companion and a housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home. For to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his nephew and niece, and their children, the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. His attachment to them all increased. The constant attention of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dashwood to his wishes, which proceeded not merely from interest, but from goodness of heart, gave him every degree of solid comfort which his age could receive, and the cheerfulness of the children added a relish to his existence. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, by his present lady, 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother, which had been large, and half of which devolved on him on his coming of age. By his own marriage, likewise, which happened soon afterwards, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not so really important as to his sisters, for their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their fathers inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father only £7,000 in his own disposal, for the remaining moiety of his first wife's fortune was also secured to her first child, and he had only a life interest in it. The old gentleman died. His will was read, and like almost every other will, gave as much disappointment as pleasure. He was neither so unjust nor so ungrateful as to leave his estate from his nephew, but he left it to him on such terms as destroyed half the value of the bequest. Mr. Dashwood had wished for it more for the sake of his wife and daughters than for himself or his son. But to his son and his son's son, a child of 4 years old, it was secured in such a way as to leave to himself no power of providing for those who were most dear to him and who most needed a provision by any change on the estate or by any sale of its valuable woods. The whole was tied up for the benefit of this child, who, in occasional visits with his father and mother at Norland, had so far gained on the affections of his uncle by such attractions as are by no means unusual in children of 2 or 3 years old, an imperfect articulation, an earnest desire of having his own way, many cunning tricks, and a great deal of noise, as to outweigh all the value of all the attention which for years he had received from his niece and her daughters. He meant not to be unkind, however, and as a mark of his affection For the three girls, he left them £1,000 apiece. Mr. Dashwood's disappointment was at first severe, but his temper was cheerful and sanguine, and he might reasonably hope to live many years and, by living economically, lay by a considerable sum from the produce of an estate already large and capable of almost immediate improvement. But the fortune, which had been so tardy in coming, was his only one 12-month. He survived his uncle no longer, and £10,000, including the late legacies, was all that remained for his widow and daughters. His son was sent for as soon as his danger was known, and to him Mr. Dashwood recommended, with all the strength and urgency which illness could command, the interest of his mother-in-law and sisters. Mr. John Dashwood had not the strong feelings of the rest of the family, but he was affected by a recommendation of such a nature at such a time, and he promised to do everything in his power to make them comfortable. His father was rendered easy by such an assurance, and Mr. John Dashwood had then leisure to consider how much there might prudently be in his power to do for them. He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed, but he was in general well-respected, for he conducted himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties. Had he married a more amiable woman, he might have been made still more respectable than he was. He might even have been made amiable himself, for he was very young when he married and very fond of his wife. But Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of himself, more narrow-minded and selfish. There's an awful lot there right at the opening of Sense and Sensibility, but it does lay the foundation for where we are going. It lays the foundation for the politeness and the decorum of the novel, and it is important to discuss inheritance and the twists and turns, because this sets the stage for future drama. We live in a time where we don't really think too much about inheritance, but it does float around underneath our perceptions of fairness, justice, and what one generation owes another. When thinking about Sense and Sensibility, we, of course, have to think about the literary life of Jane Austen. And, if you go and visit the Wikipedia article about Sense and Sensibility, you will see, and I quote, that Sense and Sensibility tells the story of the Dashwood sisters, Eleanor, age 19, and Marianne, age 16 and a half, as they come of age. They have an older half-brother, John, and a younger sister, Margaret, age 13. Sense and Sensibility has been adapted to film, radio, television, and it's never really been out of print ever since its first print run of, get this, 750 copies in the middle of 1813. It was Jane Austen's first novel, and she was born in 1775 and died in July of 1817. And she had modest success as an author during her time. We mentioned this on our episode around Persuasion. But little fame during her lifetime. However, posthumously, when Persuasion was published, she has launched in a J curve up, as they say in startup culture, and to the right. And she's never really been out of print and never really been out of discussion, not amongst her feminist critics, not amongst folks looking for insight into 18th century class mores, and even the relationships between men and women in a pre-modern English era. Sense and Sensibility is written in an epistolary form, which I didn't know what this meant, but apparently novels used to be written as if they were or modeled on the writing of letters, right, to each other. It's almost as if the novel of the primary form of the novel in the 19th century and in the 18th century, that primary form, if it were updated to today, would be as if we would be writing a novel based on the types of emails, or dare I say tweets, we send or text messages we send to each other. And by the way, Tom inserted text messages there. We are starting to see novels that do have a bit of that, and that is starting to show up in movies and in film. And it's less jarring than it was potentially back in the 1990s, early 2000s when it first started showing up. But this epistolary form This style of writing in which all of the action, dialogue, and character interactions are reflected through letters sent from one or more of the characters to each other is really the grounding. It's really the basis of Sense and Sensibility. And so the chapters are short. They're no more than 4 pages, and they do move quite quickly. Austen overcame that form and began to cobble together the modern novel. And so we're going to talk about that today, along with several other areas with, like I said before, our co-hosts today, our regular co-host, Tom Libby. And so the first question that I have, or the opener for today, after my long ramble there, is, Tom, why don't we write letters anymore? And by the way, I was writing this script. It's really weird. I was writing this script while my daughter in the other room down the hall and around the corner is clanking out. She found an old Corona typewriter somewhere in my house and is clanking out something on an old Corona typewriter. I tremble to ask what she's doing, but I do hear the clickety, 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 click. So why is it that no one sends letters anymore?
It's so weird. Like when I saw that your outline for this podcast, and I saw that question, and my first instinct was, how in God's green earth would I know? Like, and then I thought to myself, well, why don't I write letters anymore? Like, am I common enough of a thinker to think that if I have a reason behind this, that everybody, like, there'd be enough people to anyway, I overthink a lot, everyone, just to let you know. But so what happened to writing letter? It's interesting that you asked that, because my children and I joke a lot about the fact that I actually remember the day that they announced the invention of the @ sign for the for emails, right?
Yes, yes.
Tom Libby, Libby dot blah 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 at whatever.com, right? And I remember this going, who cares? Like, that's not going to be, no one's going to do anything with this. This is going to be stupid, right? Little did I know, and that's probably why I'm not a millionaire with the stock market right now either. I'm just saying. Like,
that's right. That's right.
But I think the simplest answer to this question, honestly, is because we have so many avenues to communicate at this point. Yeah. Like, so many, and most of the avenues that we currently have to communicate are very quick to respond, right? Like, we were just joking about the text messages in the dialogue and books and whatnot, right? Like, so I can send you, Hassan, a text message of a very simple question, or that you can respond to almost immediately, right? So it's literally seconds between responses. If I have something more in depth, I can write an email. I mean, and technically, if you want to use that as a form of a letter, sure, but it's not truly a letter anymore. I think our mindset has started to change of what is personal and what is impersonal, right? Like, for example, if I could send my mom a letter, we're coming up on Mother's Day. My mother lives in Missouri. I can send my mother a letter saying, hey mom, I was thinking about you, happy Mother's Day, blah, blah, blah. And she could look at this and go, why wouldn't he just send me a text, or why wouldn't he just call me? Right? Because calling her on the phone and actually speaking to her is more personal than writing a letter.
I don't know.
I think our mindset is changing to that direction, I guess, is my point.
I don't know. I hand wrote a letter to my mother during COVID about something. I can't remember. And I mean, like, it had been, I even wrote in the letter, it's been years since I actually did this. I don't even think I know how to do cursive writing anymore. Which, I mean, I had beautiful penmanship. It was very important that I have beautiful penmanship. I won't get into why, but it was very important that I have beautiful, readable penmanship. And, penmanship, writing letters. I loved how you talked about the seconds between responses. I think that's very important. We did a shorts episode that everybody should go back and listen to before they listen to this episode number 78, I think, of the shorts episodes. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But I talk about, and it kind of relates to what you're saying here, when you lose the small things, then the larger things aren't far behind. And maybe it's not losing the small things. Maybe it's redefining what the small things are.
Yes, but where I was going with this, by the way, is I think that mindset, because I also think, like, and I thought where you were going to go down, what path you were going to go down, was that if I were to write a letter to an acquaintance, I'm not talking about my mom, I'm just somebody that I just know, I haven't heard from in a long time, I'm not connected to them on Facebook or social media, whatever, right? I wrote a letter because I had their old address. Sometimes, and this actually applies to me too, sometimes when I get a letter in the mail, it's almost like a wow factor now, right? Like, so we don't use it for day-to-day communication anymore, because we have this instant. So it's not that people aren't writing letters, they're only writing them to get like a different, like, visceral response versus just a quick response, or like an answer to a question, or whereas in Jane Austen's era, I mean, you had to write a letter to get an answer to a question. Like, you had to send them a letter, then write the letter back and send it back. You could have a whole conversation that would take you a year, right? Like,
it took them. So I think about the Revolutionary War, and how the Revolutionary War was not won but run, how the operation of that war went, right?
Sure.
And for sure, Gutenberg printing press, I mean, whatever, 300 years of printing press already, everybody kind of knew what that was. It's like what's going to be, it's what's going to be 300 years into the internet. Like, we're at the beginning of the internet right now. 300 years from now, who the heck knows how they'll be running the war with the internet. Okay. But at that time, like, if you wanted to get orders from England about troop movements or things that needed to happen, you had to get a letter across the ocean, and it might not make it. The Atlantic's a big lake. And if it did make it, then you had to get it on horseback to the actual, battleground. And so you didn't deliver military, instructions via mail. You deliver them via horseback, you deliver via runner in the theater of battle. But the guys back in England, the politicians back there, they were arguing about things that had already occurred 6 months ago.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
And so you had a lot of freedom in the field because there wasn't that seconds between responses. And that's in a military context. In a social context, and Sense and Sensibility addresses some of this. Like, there's a character in here, Edward, which we'll talk about some of the characters in here, but the character Edward, he just leaves and then magically shows up, like, well, not magically, but like shows up later on, and he's like, I was riding around. Let's decide I pop in for a little cuppa, little cup of tea. Or you got another character in here who receives a letter, doesn't explain to anybody what's in the letter, and then just busts out, just pieces out.
Yeah.
And that is and we're not going to, I don't think we're going to cover that portion of the podcast today, but that is seen as such rudeness that he wouldn't tell them what was in the letter. And so they're making up all these stories, and they're making up all this gossip in their heads. And of course, they're doing what people do basically now. Sure. Human beings, right? So, and they're building these monuments in their heads. And it turns out, of course, that it's something else later on in the novel. But it is funny because he holds that letter so close, and it is, and you can see it in your head, it's the 19th century handwritten letter, the whole script, whatever, and then he just pieces out and leaves.
We have a version of that today, Hassan. We have a version of that. It's called the screen lock. So if you don't let anybody know what your screen lock is, they can't read your text messages. Right? So in other words, nothing has changed in 200 years.
No, nothing's changed in human communication at all. Very little has changed.
Zero.
It's all the same thing. Well, and this gets to sort of our second idea here, which we'll cover here in a little bit, which sort of prefaces a little bit. So in a letter, you have to be polite, because you actually have to think about the words that you're writing and how those words are going to impact somebody else. Because the paper is permanent, the ink is permanent. there's a feeling of permanency that goes along with that thing. And this is why I like the novel, because there's a feeling of permanency. This is why I love books, even though no one reads anymore. But there's, there's this feeling of permanence as well. There's a feeling of permanency with a book. Whereas with a text or a tweet or an email, I mean, like if I lose my Google Workspace account, that's like 50,000 emails. They're just bye.
Gone. Yeah.
Gone. And Google will and Google's not going to get them back for me. Google doesn't care. There's no like 1-800 number for me to call to get those emails back.
No.
So, that sense of impermanency and I love how you talk about like the visceral nature of getting a letter and the visceral emotion that's attached to that. Yeah, the reaction. Do you think that that's because of that impermanency? Like we're so familiar with the impermanency now?
Yeah, absolutely. Because again, one of the things I find myself doing lately, well, I shouldn't say lately, I've been doing it all along, but it's been on the forefront of my mind lately, is saving that stuff, right? Like, so
yeah,
my mom will send me a birthday card, and I now save that. Whereas 25, 30 years ago, I would have probably not saved it. I would have been like, oh, it's just a card, whatever, right? Because I'll get another one next year. And now it's like the card, that handwritten note inside the card from my mom, that's what I want to remember when I have Alzheimer's and I can't remember my own name. I want to be able to open that up and go, oh my God, I remember how much I loved her or whatever, right? Like it's right. So now I got a box that I have birthday cards, Father's Day cards, Christmas cards from all the people who are important in my life. And I do it because and I have them almost in sequential order, like timeline order, so to speak. So, because I fear, I got to tell you, out of all the things I fear in my life, I don't fear death. I have no fear of death. I don't fear failing. I as a matter of fact, I encourage failing because that's how you learn probably the most life lessons. I fear Alzheimer's, being able to being trapped in your own mind and not being able to know, understand, or identify what's going on around you, but still physically be okay, petrifies me. One of the ways you can combat this is doing what I'm doing and having things. I'm not certain I'm going to remember how to use a computer. So saving emails or saving text messages, probably not going to matter. But saving tangible, holdable cards, letters, it's going to matter. It's going to matter when I get to that age. Knock on wood. Hopefully I don't ever get truly Alzheimer's, but hopefully that stuff matters. And to your point, one of the things about, and I spent a lot of time in senior healthcare, by the way, so that's why this stuff scares the crap out of me. But one of the things they talk about all the time is when people do have Alzheimer's or dementia, especially severe dementia, it's not about what they think or what they know. It's about how they feel. When somebody walks into a room and they don't recognize them, but they know they feel good when they see them, that's what's important to them. So I worry about that stuff. And to your point, the value of this stuff, the value of the handwritten, whatever it is, whether it's a letter, a birthday card, Christmas card, whatever, I find that they're going to become more and more valuable as we go along, not less and less.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it goes to this idea of not how do you want to be remembered, but how do you want to remember, which is fundamental, right? And I know we're a leadership podcast, and we'll get to the leadership elements here that are in Sense and Sensibility, because there are leadership elements in Sense and Sensibility here, particularly around politeness and decorum. I think those are critical things that don't very often get talked about, and this is where Austen really shines. But this idea of the epistolary form as a novel, and then taking that form and turning it into something that's more permanent in order to attach meaning to it. And now, well over 200 years later, we're at a point where impermanence is everywhere. And so how do you hold on to that? I think that's a critical thing, because we've built these weird digital towers to ourselves online. And yet we also have this fear inside of us that like no one's going to care in 200 years. Just like 1,000 years ago, no one really cared about the medieval guy who was struggling on the farm in Europe or hunting in Africa, or riding a horse along the steppes in Asia. Like those people are died unrecorded with their voices unheard. And that's been the massive that's the normal thing in human nature, is for human beings, or not even human nature, but in human existence, is the normal thing is to be forgotten. And the people who remember you are the people in your community, the people in your family, the people in your tribe. And by the way, those are the people that you remember. Those are the people that you remember. So I think you're onto something here. I think you're onto something. I should probably save more of my Christmas cards, because normally I do. Normally I just throw that stuff away, or I'll I don't. I don't. I think I'm gonna have to rethink that now.
You're welcome.
See, we all get insights on this podcast. It's good for everybody. All right, back to the book. Back to Sense and Sensibility. So we're going to move ahead a little bit, and Sir John Dashwood has now moved his family into Norland Estate, and Mrs. Dashwood, the widow of Sir John's father there, has now been moved to another estate named Barton Park. And so we're going to pick up with Mrs. Dashwood being there in Barton Park, and so Mrs. Dashwood's daughters are the three that we mentioned: Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret. Okay, and so they're living in Barton Park. They're just moving in, and we're going to pick them up here because there's a point that I want to make about politeness, about the small things. So back to Sense and Sensibility. The arrival of a new family in the country was always a matter of joy to him. By the way, the him is Sir John, the owner of Barton. So the arrival of a new family in the country was always a matter of joy to him, and in every point of view, he was charmed with the inhabitants he had now procured for his cottage at Barton. The Miss Dashwoods were young, pretty, and unaffected. It was enough to secure his good opinion, for to be unaffected was all that a pretty girl could want to make her mind as captivating as her person. The friendliness of his disposition made him happy in accommodating those whose situation might be considered, in comparison with the past, as unfortunate. In shewing kindness to his cousins, therefore, he had the real satisfaction of a good heart, and in settling a family of females only in his cottage, he had all the satisfaction of a sportsman. For a sportsman, though he esteems only those of his sex who are sportsmen likewise, is not often desirous of encouraging their taste by admitting them to a residence within his own manor. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughters were met at the door of the house by Sir John, who welcomed them to Barton Park with unaffected sincerity. And as he attended them to the drawing room, repeated to the young ladies the concern which the same subject had drawn from him the day before, at being unable to get any smart young men to meet them. They would see, he said, only one gentleman there beside himself, a particular friend who was staying at the park, but who was neither very young nor very gay. He hoped they would all excuse the smallness of the party and could assure them it should never happen so again. He had been to several families that morning in hopes of procuring some addition to their number, but it was moonlight, and everybody was full of engagements. Luckily, Lady Middleton's mother had arrived at Barton within the last hour, and as she was a very cheerful, agreeable woman, he hoped the young ladies would not find it so very dull as they might imagine. The young ladies, as well as their mother, were perfectly satisfied with having two entire strangers of the party and wished for no more. Mrs. Jennings, Lady Middleton's mother, was a good-humored, merry, fat, elderly woman who talked a great deal, seemed very happy, and rather vulgar. She was full of jokes and laughter, and before dinner was over had said many witty things on a subject of lovers and husbands, hoped they had not left their hearts behind them in Sussex, and pretended to see them blush whether they did or not. Marianne was vexed at it for her sister's sake, and turned her eyes towards Eleanor to see how she bore these attacks, with an earnestness which gave Eleanor far more pain than could arise from such commonplace raillery as Mrs. Jennings. Colonel Brandon, the friend of Sir John, seemed no more adapted by resemblance of any manner to be his friend than Lady Middleton was to be his wife, or Mrs. Jennings to be Lady Middleton's mother. He was silent and grave. His appearance, however, was not unpleasing. in spite of his being, in the opinion of Marianne and Margaret, an absolute old bachelor, for he was on the wrong side of 5 and 30. But though his face was not handsome, his countenance was sensible, and his address was particularly gentlemanlike. There was nothing in any of the party which could recommend them as companions to the Dashwoods, but the cold insipidity of Lady Middleton was so particularly repulsive that, in comparison of it to the gravity of Colonel Brandon and even the boisterous mirth of Sir John and his mother-in-law, was interesting. Lady Middleton seemed to be roused to enjoyment only by the entrance of her 4 noisy children after dinner, who pulled her about, tore her clothes, and put an end to every kind of discourse except what related to themselves. In the evening, Marianne was discovered to be musical. She was invited to play. The instrument was unlocked, everybody prepared to be charmed, and Marianne, who sang very well, at their request, went through the chief of the songs which Lady Middleton had brought into the family on her marriage, and which perhaps had lain ever since in the same position on the pianoforte, for her ladyship had celebrated that event by giving up music, although by her mother's account she had played extremely well, and by her own was very fond of it. A lot of dynamics going on in that little section, that little piece. That's only like 2 pages of Sense and Sensibility. A lot of dynamics in there. There's dynamics of interpersonal politeness. There's dynamics of decorum. What does it mean to tell the truth to people? Should they have called out Lady Middleton as being an insipid bore, or should they have just let her go? And would that have changed anything anyway? In our modern era, where we like to speak truth to power, where the personal is political, we believe that politeness represents oppression, or not living out your quote unquote full self, whatever the hell that may mean, right? I've also recently heard, or maybe I've read it on Twitter from people who are pushing certain agendas very hard and ideological positions very hard. They're going, as we used to say back in street ball, hard to the hoop on this one. But I've heard that politeness is part of the structure of white supremacy. Okay. This is nonsense, though. Like, once decorum and politeness is abandoned, we see the creeping specter of tyrannical behavior, but it's tyrannical behavior at its lowest level, right? It's tyrannical behavior, it's tyrannical posture in places where it shouldn't be: family, friends, relationships. I mean, how many articles do you read every Thanksgiving when people are written for people to be able to talk about politics around the Thanksgiving table so we won't be so polarized? Look, politeness and decorum, the way that it's framed in Sense and Sensibility, may to our ears sound as though it is full of constraints and not allowing people to be their full self. But that kind of constraint from 200 years ago is in exact opposition to the idea that the personal is political. Some things are too private, too personal, or even too beyond the boundaries of decorum to discuss, and should probably be left in that box of the private and the unspoken. But as we have expanded the franchise, and as the unspoken things now won't shut the hell up, well, we've gotten ourselves in a little bit of trouble. This is a challenge for leaders, right? How do you set up the terms of the team? How do you set up the environment when everybody wants to talk about everything, including, well, the 3 main things you once never talked about: sex, religion, and money? Everybody, and by the way, we replace religion with politics now. So sex, politics, and money, right? So Tom,
it's funny that you say that.
How can leaders replace politeness? How can they get back to politeness and decorum? How do we get back to there from here?
Well, it's funny, like, do you say that because I like that white supremacy comment, Jason, just threw me.
I'm dead. I am not kidding you. I see it on Twitter.
I've never really thought about that. Like, politeness is I forget how you worded it. Honestly,
politeness as a structural act of white supremacy.
White supremacy. So let me get this straight. Like, I'm dumbfounded by this one. I got to be honest. Like,
go ahead, man.
So people are in their brain thinking that somebody who's being polite to you, that is that's part of the system of racism. That's the systematic, just being polite. You'd rather me be rude? I'm sorry. Like, I want to make sure I understand this.
Oh, no. Here's the framing. I can go into these people's heads. So let me go into these people's heads and walk around for a little bit here for you.
Just for a second, because I want to get back to the question, but
yeah. So politeness and decorum, by these people's framing, is seen as a method of oppression. And all oppression, by the feminist, some of the feminist theorizing of oppression, all oppression is structurally based on power. And so when you are oppressing people from talking about things that are core to their identity, you are engaged in a position of labeling and a position of power. And usually that position of power is patriarchal, and usually the dominant group, which is, from again their framing, the white male Christian dominant group, they are framing that lack of conversation in an attempt to engage in in hierarchical power games, which we're going to talk about hierarchy in a minute, but in hierarchical power games that oppress everybody who is outside of those dominant power structures from living their full self. That was a way longer explanation, but that's where they're coming from.
But I, at the risk of sounding like I'm validating, which I'm not. At least I kind of get it now. The way that you framed it. I'm just saying I at least understand.
You can understand
their. Yeah. I'm not saying I agree with it, but okay. I at least now I get a little bit of the insights of it now. And just to remind the viewers who are looking at this video, please do not let the skin color fool you. I am of Native American descent, so when Hassan talks about white supremacy and stuff like that, I'm not taking offense to it. I just want to be clear on this.
And those of you who are listening to the audio, clear diction is not a symbol of white supremacy.
Yes.
I want to be very clear on this. Clear diction is a sign that you have the skill of speaking a particular language. I would want clear diction if I was speaking Swahili. I would want clear diction if I were speaking Japanese. I would want clear diction if I were speaking Spanish. Clear diction is a sign of education. It is a sign of respect, honestly, for the language and decorum. But anyway, moving on.
Yeah. So how do leaders reclaim politeness and decorum? Listen, it takes no effort to be polite to somebody. I mean, I've been in environments where I'm firing 5 people, and when they walk out the room, they're smiling and happy, like not happy that they got fired, but you do not have to be rude, crude, or miserable to get your point across, and you certainly don't. This one kind of stood out to me too when you sent me the outline of the podcast today, because I'm like, how can leaders reclaim? What is there to reclaim? You should have been doing it from day one and ongoing. I don't like.
Well, I think we wind up in a space of polar. So
yeah,
this is that whole Marshall McLuhan, the personal is political thing, taken all the way to like the bottom level of like a thimbleful of water. Like, well, this is the kinds of conversations you actually wind up having to have when political topics are discussed in a leadership context in the workplace.
Yeah. And listen, sometimes it's not even what you say, it's the manner in which you say it, right? I can look at you, and I think I might have mentioned that you and I might have had a discussion like this at some point in the near past, but like sometimes it has nothing to do with the words that are coming out of your mouth. It has more to do in the way and the manner in which you hold yourself when you say them. For example, I'll just give the listeners and the viewers a good example. I can look at you and go, "Hey son, you suck," right? And then I can look at you a different day and be like, "Oh my God," I'm like, "Hey son, you suck, man." Like, it's the same words, but I'm guaranteeing you react differently to the way that I say it. Yes. Right? Like, it's so how do
if I tell you that I love you, that's a totally different thing than when I tell my wife I love her.
Yes, exactly.
And by the way, if I told it to you the way that I tell it to my wife, that would
your wife would have a problem with that.
Yes, that's correct. My wife would have an issue.
You're right. But again, in fairness, I think this question is not so much about reclaiming. It's more so much about mindfulness and understanding who you're talking to and how you're talking to people. And I don't think I've ever been considered, let me rephrase this. I'm sure I have. I was going to say, like, in certain environments, being impolite or having no decorum, that's just, I've never been accused of that in the professional environments. I have definitely been accused of that in my personal life, because sometimes I just don't care what my family thinks. I'll just say whatever I want to say.
Okay,
right?
well, that's the thing, that just don't care thing. Okay, so we are now in a leadership environment, and we have been for a while now. I would say probably about the last 10 years. And the leadership environment of the last 10 years is an environment where, again, I need to make a space for everyone as a leader. I am required to make a space for everyone to show up with their true selves. Okay, but here's the pushback on this, and I've always pushed back on this. Number one, work level relationships are always what we call in anthropology second level relationships. They're not first level relationships. And it doesn't matter how much of your work is your identity, there is still that separation. And I don't care if you're working remotely, working from home, working in a hybrid situation, or working, on site. I don't care where your team is, right? There's a separation that we create psychologically. And by the way, we've been doing this ever since we were pushing, ever since people were pushing donkeys behind cracking on a donkey to pull a plow, right? Like you go out in the field, right? Or you leave the home to go foraging or to go hunt, right? Or you go to another center place in the village, right? To weave the cotton, right? You talked about being a Native American. In Native American tribal environments, people left the teepee to go do stuff and then came back. Is that correct? Or left whatever the housing situation was, right? Am I incorrect in this? Yeah. Okay. Now sometimes they did some stuff, and don't get me wrong, they did some stuff in the home. Everybody did, but like for the most part, you left and then come back. There's something that's important about human beings physically leaving a space and going into another space that creates a barrier. It creates a barrier of separation of place. But now
it's a mental mind frame you change.
Right. But now we have all of this collapsing of categories that's been happening for the last 10 years. And inside of that collapsing of categories, some people, not everybody, some people are demanding of leaders, you have to make a space for me to bring my true self because all my categories have to collapse here in this space. And I don't know how you maintain that. I'll be honest, I don't know how you maintain that.
I don't think you can. I had a conversation, again, all of my kids are adults at this point. I had a conversation with one of my kids about their job in the past, and they were like, well, they were complaining about this or that. And I go, well, then get a new job. Well, right. I shouldn't have to. They should just, no. If you don't like it, go get a new job. Like they shouldn't have to fit you into their, like you should, it should be a puzzle piece that fits with everybody. Not everyone's going to fit with everybody. Like and you need to make sure that the cogs in the wheel all mesh, right? Like, yeah. So if your current job is not making, as you put it, making your space for you, then go find one that will. You should go work where you're wanted and honored and respected and whatever. And if you are trying to make an employer forcibly mold into that, it's not going to happen. It's, or at least not
well, long, but there's a long history but wait a minute. On the opposite side of that, there's a long history in the United States of political institutions having pressure put on them and changing.
Yeah.
Now they're not changing hearts. Let's be real. Okay. They're just changing the systemic, to use a social justice term, the systemic structures of how the system operates, right? So the 1964 Civil Rights Act, right? Like that was evidence of, people putting some external pressure on not really systematized racism, but okay, we'll just use that framing for the moment. Systematized racism and creating new laws that allowed access for African Americans to places where they had not had access before. Okay, so there's some evidence, and you can't take this away from this idea from folks, that if you just put pressure on the structure and don't leave, the structure will change. There's precedent for that.
Sure. Yeah. I agree.
And that structure, in the people's minds, they don't separate the government from work. It's all these larger structures that are outside of themselves that they have no control over. So why wouldn't they just hang around with the employer and protest? Why not?
Hold on now though, because here's the difference. The major difference here, when you're talking about the system, governmental systems and things like that, then I say rage against the machine, because you can make changes. A company's a little different. If they see that one person, if you are standing alone and they fire you, you're done, right? Like it's completely different. Where
so don't rage against the corporate machine. I don't think that really works with Rage. I don't think Rage really put that on their last album. I think that one kind of wound up there. I don't think one made it down the mountain.
No, but you know what I'm saying, right? Yeah. Like unless you are organizing and structured, like you need to have some real support behind you in the corporate environment. You need to have a certain percentage of the company that is behind you, or it doesn't change. Like, and I don't know whether it's 5%, 10%, 50%. I'm assuming the company is going to be different. Like that number is going to change with the company, the size, the structure of the company, whatever. Yeah. The government's different. With one voice, you can make a difference if you are stern enough, strong enough, and want to stand firm enough with one voice. Because people will eventually start following you, and you can build it. In a corporate environment, you can't build it. You make that leap too early, they just fire you.
Is that because, and there's been also a lot of lamenting over the last, I would say, 35 years of the decline of private sector unions?
Oh, definitely. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Because what unions did for the majority, well, not even the majority, for at least 30 years of the back half of the 20th century, what they did was they set up the unions basically acted as that structure of negotiated power, right, against the corporate structure, right, with government kind of just hanging out over there and maybe jumping in if they needed to. And so you had four major structures, right? You had family and community, you had government, you had unions, and you had the corporations. Big, small, little, didn't matter. Now, all of those organizations, all four of those systems, if I were more of a social justice warrior, I would say conspired or colluded. I'm more of a realist, so I'm just going to say made decisions, and then all the other systems made other decisions. When you have four masses, they're just going to play off of each other. It's just kind of the human. I don't see evil behind that, but okay.
There could be, but I'm just saying.
Sure, there could be. Your mileage may vary on what you see. I believe in my own conspiracy theories that I make up. Okay. So you've got those four systems, right? And the individual inside of those four systems at least had, from their perspective, at least had the unions to be able to go and counterbalance all of those other structures. Now, you get on the other side of globalization, you get on the other side of the 1970s, and now we're into a different dynamic where you're right. It is one person alone negotiating with the system.
But to your point, you were right. With the unions, that one person had a voice, and they weren't fearful of being fired because of their opinion with that union structure.
So now this follows through to the next question, which is, were things more polite when it was only those four mass structures? Family, community, government, unions, and the corporate structure.
I don't know. Honestly, I don't think, I've never belonged to a union, so I couldn't speak to that. Like if there was some advantage to that, but I mean, I've spent a lot of time in the corporate world, so it's.
Well, I will say that unions did a really awesome job of. People talk a lot about the top 1% and sort of how corporate CEOs make too much money and da. What the unions did was they flattened all of that. So it wasn't that a CEO in the 1950s and 1960s, it wasn't that they were making less per capita than their comparable compatriots 50 years later, or 60 years later, or 70 years later. They actually were making pretty much the same. Like corporate CEO salaries are pretty much the same. But what happened was the compensation structures outside of salaries became more robust. because what the unions did was they basically forced wage inflation at the CEO level downward. Yeah. And so the compensation then had to shift into other areas. So for instance, the CEO of Ford got paid per capita pretty much what the CEO of Ford gets paid now, but their compensation package of stock options, a private car, a mistress, whiskey and bourbon in the bottle. Oh yeah, I said it. All of that. For those of you who are listening on the audio, Tom is now turning red, laughing when I said mistress. It's part of the compensation package. That whole compensation package is now underwritten in a different kind of way and has become more robust, particularly because of stock options, has become more robust, whereas back in the day, the unions compressed all of that.
Yeah. So I think if I were to have to answer it just with one word, like yes or no, I would have to say yes, right? Like because we forced. I think part of what you're talking about too is the family and the union units were almost like on your side, and the corporate and the government was on the other side, and it was even. They had to be polite when the power is even, right? Like they had no choice because you couldn't be doing what you're doing today, meaning, oh, that guy's a squeaky wheel in the cog, let's fire him. Right. That didn't happen like that back then. So if I had to answer a simple answer, I would say then yes. Okay. But again, we talked a lot about some of the things that we were hoping took over for those unions as they dissipated. Were things like minimum wage going up at a reasonable rate, the government getting rid of, the time and a half was now instituted by the government, that, things like that were all starting to be governed now. So the unions started to kind of go away. But to your point, I think that power started to kind of lopside back the other way.
Well, so the other dynamic that almost no one ever considers, and this is a business podcast as well as being a literature podcast, so we do have to mention this dynamic because we kind of tap danced around it. But the other thing the union does, and no one ever talks about this, but the other thing the union did was it kept out women and minorities. Yeah. It did a really awesome job of doing that. And so if you were a minority male in this country, you couldn't, I would say you couldn't. It was really hard to get a union job.
Yeah, for sure.
Like really hard, like stupidly hard. And if you were a woman, oh, forget it. Get out of town. You're not going to get a union job. You're going to be the wife of a person who has a union job. And that's about where it stops. Now, as unions decline, the franchise, as my lawyer buddy would say, the franchise expands, right? So you have more people in the pool, which as from a corporation's perspective, that's good. Because now what you can do is you can spread out the cost of labor across all of these other demographic areas. And you can also, because you're the only power in town now, only government's counterbalancing you. So now you can depress wages while also expanding the franchise, which is why every single time Amazon workers vote for a union, it fails every single time. I don't know what's happening with Starbucks. But I do definitely see a shift happening, but it's going to happen not because of cultural means of politeness. It's going to happen because of political issues that are translated into cultural mores. Yeah. So, I can see people unionizing because they want to use a particular bathroom.
Yeah. But to get back to your original, this original.
Reclaim politeness and decorum.
What started this whole debacle of conversation was can leaders reclaim politeness and decorum? And the fact, I still stand to my guns here. I think the fact of the matter is we shouldn't be reclaiming anything. It should have never left in the first place. You do not need to be told to treat people with a little bit of dignity and respect. And you shouldn't be told to I think the other thing and the decorum thing, I think this could be a podcast all by itself, because I think we are losing grip on how we present ourselves in certain environments. I just think it brings me back to the old Brady Bunch. Put on your Sunday best, kids. We're going to Sears, right? people dressed a certain way to go to certain functions. People dressed a certain way. They held themselves in a certain way when they're in certain environments, whether it be weddings or funerals or bridal showers, corporate parties, corporate functions, things like. And now all of a sudden, it just seems like I can dress in a t-shirt and shorts. I don't care that I'm going to a wedding. It just blows my mind how we have deteriorated how we present ourselves in a manner like this. And back then, in Jane Austen's time, would have never happened.
Well, and then this is where we look at the thing that happened in Jane Austen's time. We look at it through this postmodern lens, and we go, "That they were repressed. We're just so much freer because we know more." No, not really. You know, we talked about this a little bit off the air before we started recording, but I think it's worthwhile to say here, when the little things go, the big things aren't far behind, right? And so, you know, people have been complaining, leaders have been complaining about the casual nature of dress, particularly in the workplace, for at minimum since, gosh, the early 90s, when I can remember first hearing that lament. I think that if leaders want a tactical thing to take out of this, all this entire conversation and mishmash around Jane Austen, the tactical thing to take out of this is you can set the clothing standard.
Yes.
Now, you may not have people who want to work with you, but to Tom's point, if we really are in a free market of labor and capital, and labor can go wherever the heck it wants, you set the standard as the leader. And if labor doesn't agree with it, labor can go pound sand. There's another job across the street.
Yeah,
we dress in top hat and tails here. Well, I don't want to dress in top hat and tails. There's another job right across the street. As Alec Baldwin said infamously in The Departed, the world always needs more bartenders. Like
absolutely.
When you can be one over there.
And you know, and this all stems from the Steve Jobs era, right? When he came out on that stage as the CEO of Apple in a turtleneck,
and black turtleneck, like,
yeah. No shirt and tie, no suit coat, and all of a sudden everybody went, well, if he can do it, and he's the top producing blah 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 whatever, then everybody should be able to do it, because we learn from the top down, right? Like we model from the top down. And I was told as a kid, don't dress for the job you want, dress for the job you have. So now I'm a sales guy back then, wearing a suit every day. And I'm like, well, if I want his job, I have to wear a turtleneck to work tomorrow. My boss was like, no, no, if you want this job, you're wearing a suit tomorrow.
I see these turtlenecks walk through this door. We're going to have a problem.
I was like, all right, I guess I'm wearing a suit tomorrow. I don't really want Steve Jobs' job.
Well, and there are. And maybe I'm ringing the bell on something that doesn't need to be rung. I do think that and this is the last thing I'll say about Politeness and Decorum. We're gonna turn the corner a little bit here.
Moving on, yeah.
We'll move on. But one last thing that I think bears stating. I think in family, in small businesses, we do have a lot of folks who run small businesses who listen to our podcast. Civic government, particularly at the state level, going all the way down, there is still an understanding that decorum, politeness, dress, posture, speech, these are more than just performative check marks. These are standards of maintaining. I'll frame it even more bluntly than this. They are a thumb in the dam or in the dike against the crashing water of chaos that is behind that. And that's all that civilization is. Civilization is the battle to create boundaries around chaos, right? And to contain it and to hold it down, right? There's my youngest son likes to listen to, and I'm going to give a shout out to this author, John R.R. Erickson and Hank the Cowdog. And it's a whole series of these Western themed books that are about a cow dog, and it's written from the perspective of the dog, right? And the dog's adventures and all that. And one episode, He's basically yelling at another dog for eating too loudly out of a hubcap, and oh, it's hilarious. I laugh every time I hear it on the audio recording that my kid has, and he's sort of memorized this. But one of the things that the dog says, that Hank the dog says to the other dog Drover, is eating loudly is basically a lack of decorum, is what he's saying. Eating loudly, having bad manners means that you're behaving like a hog. But no one expects hogs to have civilization. But we're dogs. We're supposed to hold back the chaos and be the representatives of civilization. And the other dog, of course, is the comedic straight man, and kind of goes, "What? I didn't hear that. The kernels were hard. Like not holding back chaos is hard. The kernels were hard." And I crack up every time I hear it. But it's going down to the 5-year-old set, right? But
the lesson's still the same, though. Like,
we're still doing this. This is what I'm saying. Like, I think we are still holding on. I just think it's our cultural elite, maybe our political elite, maybe our thought elite. This is why I've never styled myself as a thought leader. I think those folks are operating in a different kind of atmosphere. But even there, I will bet you, if I leapfrogged into that space, I'm not coming in there with a turtleneck and saying, as my grandmother would have said back in the day, "Dis here and that there." Like, it's not happening.
I'm with you.
So, all right, back to the book. Back to Sense and Sensibility. We almost did have a whole entire podcast on that. That one thing just by itself. And this is, by the way, this is a topic that we're going to revisit, because I do believe Austen has a lot. This is where Austen and Bronte we're going to cover some of the works of Charlotte Bronte. I think we're going to be talking about Jane Eyre coming up here fairly soon on the podcast. When women writers write, particularly women writers of the 17th and 18th and 19th century, when they write, they are writing about the things they are observing in the intimate areas of family, of community. They're not writing about the large sweeping trajectory areas like men tend to write about. They're writing about the small things. We need both of those. We need the big thing. We need the big vision. We need the great man idea, but we also need the great woman idea, or the great person idea, if we don't want to be gendered, of people behaving in small spheres in ways that evince leadership, because that is where leadership really begins, is in those small spheres. Back to the book, back to Sense and Sensibility. We're going to go move ahead here to chapter 10. And there's a gentleman named Willoughby who's now going to start showing up. Willoughby is the gentleman caller, along with Edward, who is romancing one of the characters in here, Marianne. And so chapter 10, we talk about Willoughby and sort of his nature of being attracted to Marianne. And keep in mind, Marianne in this book is 16 and a half, right? And so we're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean? What does it mean to be past your prime? They speedily discovered that their enjoyment of dancing and music, this is Willoughby and Marianne, was mutual, and that it arose from a general conformity of judgment in all that related to either. Encouraged by this to a further examination of his opinions, she proceeded to question him on the subject of books. Her favorite authors were brought forward and dwelt upon with so rapturous a delight that any young man of 5 and 20 must have been insensible indeed not to become an immediate convert to the excellence of such works, however disregarded before. Their taste was strikingly alike. The same books, the same passages were idolized by each, or if any difference appeared, any objection arose. It lasted no longer than till the force of her arguments and the brightness of her eyes could be displayed. He acquiesced in all her decisions, caught all her enthusiasm, and long before his visit concluded, they conversed with the familiarity of a long-established acquaintance. "Well, Marianne," said Eleanor, as soon as he had left them, "for one morning, I think you have done pretty well. You have already ascertained Mr. Willoughby's opinion in almost every matter of importance. You know what he thinks of Cowper and Scott. You are certain of his estimating their beauties as he ought, and you have received every assurance of his admiring Pope no more than is proper. But how is your acquaintance to be long supported under such extraordinary dispatch of every subject for discourse? You will soon have exhausted each favorite topic. Another meeting will suffice to explain his sentiments on picturesque beauty and second marriages, and then you can have nothing farther to ask." Eleanor, cried Marianne, is this fair? Is this just? Are my ideas so scanty? But I see what you mean. I have been too much at my ease, too happy, too frank. I have erred against every commonplace notion of decorum. I have been open, sincere, where I ought to have been reserved, spiritless, dull, and deceitful. Had I talked only of the weather and the roads, and I had spoken only once in 10 minutes, this reproach would have been spared. My love, said her mother, you must not be offended with Eleanor. She was only in jest. I should scold her myself if she were capable of wishing to check the delight of your conversation with our new friend. Marianne was softened in a moment. Willoughby, on his side, gave every proof of his pleasure in their acquaintance, which an evident wish of improving it could offer. He came to them every day. To inquire after Marianne was at first his excuse, but the encouragement of his reception, to which every day gave greater kindness, made such an excuse unnecessary before it had ceased to be possible by Marianne's perfect recovery. She was confined for some days to the house, but never had any confinement been less irksome. Willoughby was a young man of good abilities, quick imagination, lively spirits, and an open, affectionate manner. He was exactly formed to engage Marianne's heart, for with all this he joined not only a captivating person, but a natural ardor of mind, which was now roused and increased by the example of her own, and which recommended him to her affection beyond everything else. His society became gradually her most exquisite enjoyment. They read, they talked, they sang together. His musical talents were considerable, and he read with all the sensibility and spirit which Edward had unfortunately wanted. In Mrs. Dashwood's estimation, he was as faultless as in Marianne's, and Eleanor saw nothing to censure in him but a propensity, in which he strongly resembled and peculiarly delighted her sister, of saying too much what he thought on every occasion, without attention to persons or circumstances, in hastily forming and giving his opinions of other people, in sacrificing general politeness to the enjoyment of the undivided attention where his heart was engaged, and in slighting too easily the forms of worldly propriety, he displayed a want of caution, which Eleanor could not approve, in spite of all that he and Marianne could say in its support. I'm going to skip over a few things here, and I'm going to go right to one point here. Colonel Brandon's partiality for Marianne, which had so early been discovered by his friends, now first became perceptible to Eleanor. Now, Colonel Brandon is another gentleman who has come along. He was originally at Barton Park and was considered to be old by Marianne's standards. Their attention and wit were drawn off to his more fortunate rival, that would be Willoughby, and the raillery which the other had incurred before any partiality arose was removed when his feelings began really to call for the ridicule so justly annexed to sensibility. Eleanor was obliged, though unwillingly, to believe that the sentiments which Miss Jennings had assigned to him for her own satisfaction were now actually excited by her sister, and that, however, a general resemblance of disposition between the parties might forward the affection of Mr. Willoughby, an equally striking opposition of character was no hindrance to the regard of Colonel Brandon. She saw it with concern, for what could a silent man of 35 hope when opposed to a very lively one of 25? And as she could not even wish him successful, she heartily wished him indifferent. She liked him, in spite of his gravity and reserve. She beheld him an object of interest. His manners, though serious, were mild, and his reserve appeared rather the result of some oppression of spirits than of any natural gloominess of temper. Sir John had dropped hints of past injuries and disappointments, which justified her belief of his being an unfortunate man, and she regarded him with respect and compassion. 35 and 16 and a half. Oh, and 25 and 16 and a half. I'm going to let you all, while you're listening, kind of wander through that in your head for a minute. But back in the pre-modern era, back in the pre-industrial era, 16, 15, even 14, that was marriageable age for a woman. And there were many women who married men who were considered to be old, in their 30s, even up into their 40s and 50s. And these women were barely teenagers, what we would call teenagers these days themselves. However, that concept of adolescence didn't exist back in the day. That's something that has really come about. It really began post-World War I, but really gained speed in America post-World War II. And the reality is that right along with this concept of adolescence, industrialization, cultural changes in the West, and globalization have reduced the number of children that individuals have had, and thus created a reality where we are now through the looking glass on the other side, where childhood and adolescence has been extended out to 25, in some cases 30 or 35. And those of you who are listening know exactly what I'm talking about. You have an adult in your basement. But then there's biology. And biology doesn't care about industrialization, and biology doesn't care about cultural mores, and biology doesn't care about what is proper or appropriate. Biology merely cares about itself, right? And it will not be denied, no matter what fancy technology humans throw at it. And we're doing a really awesome job of throwing a lot of fancy technology at biology. And it doesn't matter, because here's the reality. The human species wants to propagate. And what they're talking about in Sense and Sensibility are the cultural acts. What Austen is talking about in Sense and Sensibility are the cultural acts that exist around the propagation of the species. How do people get together? How do they make babies? How does the species continue? That's all biology cares about. And what's interesting in our era is we've also got 40 under 40 lists and 30 under 30 lists, and increasingly, weirdly enough, 50 under 50 lists. Tom's looking for an invite to that one, as am I, by the way.
It has to come soon.
And right quick. How can leaders embrace their age, right? And by the way, let's go back to the text a little bit here. What can a man of 5 and 30 say to a man of 5 and 20 that could possibly be competitive?
Well, it's funny, it is funny how things kind of change like this. Like, it's so weird, right? To think the biology of it all. I think, again, if you go back to Jane Austen's time, the average lifespan was a hell of a lot shorter than today.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
You're talking 50, 55 was a really good life. I mean, you probably live into your early 60s and then you're done, right? Like, that's, I mean, if you moved into your early to mid 60s, you were like ancient. They were thinking you were around when Socrates was around. You know what I mean? Like,
well, it's interesting you mentioned Socrates. There is some evidence that Romans, I've been reading this recently based on some new DNA stuff and some ways that they've been able to look at anthropological samples and kind of date those. There is some evidence that Romans, at the very minimum anyway, lived into at least their 70s, sometimes their 80s, right? Now, in pre-industrialized England, where the diets were a little bit more funky, and where the genetic how can I put it, material was kind of in one little bottle for quite some time, that probably presented some challenges as well.
There's also something to be said too, and you guys can go research this all you want, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that the native peoples of this continent, my people, would live into their 70s and 80s on a very regular basis.
Okay. Yeah.
But our lifestyle was different. The way that we viewed personal hygiene was different. Like, there was a lot of differences in that. Anyway, regardless, my point is, it was not uncommon for people to die in their late 50s, early 60s back then. Today, we're looking at people still working into their 70s.
Oh, yeah.
So I think just even from that perspective, that changes that entire dynamic, because if your life expectancy is that much better, then why would you want to marry at that age? Why would you want to marry at that young? Like, there's a lot to be learned about life before you marry, if you're thinking about it from that 16-year-old's perspective, right? So right. I think there's, but then again, so to your question though, how leaders can embrace their age when it comes to, I think, look, I'm never going to be one that people are going to accuse of being wise, right? So I still look to some of my mentors and some of the and people that I've known for years and years that are a significant amount of years older than me. I constantly go back to them, because even at 55, 60, 65, you are still in a position to continue learning as you go. There's so much change that happens that these people are still learning. And there's something to be said about taking that new knowledge and battering ramming it with the older knowledge, and you come out with wisdom, right? Like, you know this, you know that, you're going to smash them together, and it creates this ball of wisdom that we can all learn from. I think when you get to a certain age, and I think I might be coming up on that age, but when you get to a certain age, you have to recognize that you're no longer, that old knowledge is now enough backfilled, that the new knowledge you have to, I don't know if I'm wording this right, but I feel like I am getting to that age that the new stuff that I learned has to be managed with the old stuff that I already know, and then relay that in a way that someone is going to learn from it, right? Like because they're coming up with the new stuff already. They're seeing the new stuff, and I'm seeing how the new stuff impacts the old stuff.
But again, I think we have to riddles, but I think we have to separate what new stuff are we talking about. So I separate out, I'll use a perfect example of this: Substack and Medium. Remember when everybody had Medium? Remember when everybody was like, oh, go look at my Medium account, go look at my Medium account. Remember that? Right. Yeah. Okay. Then Substack came along, and people were like, people ran away from Medium and ran right to Substack. Now, I'm not a person of wisdom either. I have a few interesting ideas, but I wouldn't say I'm a person of wisdom yet. I've got a few more years before my cranky old man years kick in, and then it'll be really dynamic. I'll still be doing the podcast. It's going to be awesome. But I looked at the people moving, the writers moving from Medium to Substack, and I thought, that's just more of the same. Their model's going to be, it's the same. How are you going to get paid differently? Fast forward 6 years, and guess what? Substack's model is now getting ready to get eaten by Twitter community notes. Am I going to run to Twitter community notes because it's the new thing? No, not any of that. I don't need it. Now, I think we've got to separate out, but I think we have to separate that kind of dynamic out from the other pieces of that. And that's where I reject like the 40 under 40 list and the 30 under 30 list. I thought things are nonsense.
Oh, I agree with that. But I was thinking more on the lines of, you're thinking more on the lines of like these physical, like I can wrap my hands around this, I was thinking more like when I talk to young people, like young salespeople, again, remind everybody, like I'm a sales and marketing consultant, right? So yeah. I spend my world around sales and marketing software, sales and marketing processes, blah, blah, blah. And so when I think about learning new things, I'm talking about learning a new piece of marketing software or learning and trying to blend that in with some of the marketing, like some of the things that you learn about sales and marketing at a very young age. Because here's the thing, especially in sales and marketing, I tell people all the time, the more things change, the more things stay the same. Just remember, when you're selling a product or service and you're looking at a customer, the interaction is going to be the same, whether you're using technology or not. You're gonna talk to that person. You're gonna message that person. When you're talking about a true enterprise level sales professional, no matter what technology you throw in there, people still buy from people that they know, like, and trust. People still buy from brands that they know, like, and trust. It has less to do with the newest, greatest, latest technology that's out there. It has less to do with that. Now, the way that you drive that information to them might be different. It's the vehicle might change, but the thing is the same. Like the result is the same, and the words are the same. It's the vehicle that changes. And who cares about the vehicle? I don't care what it is. I can change the vehicle 100 times.
So this is the thing we have to separate. I think we have to separate. Yeah. I'm a big fan of talking about sales marketing. I have both of David Ogilvy's books, Ogilvy on Advertising and Confessions of an Ad Man. Brilliant books. Learned a lot about branding, Learned a lot about advertising from reading David Ogilvy. You know how David Ogilvy, I mean, he was notorious for this, right? Someone would ask him, how do you come up with all these great ads? And he would say, I go into a room with a pencil and a bottle of whiskey, and I come out and there's an ad.
Yeah.
You don't need a fancy phone. You don't need like a fancy laptop. You don't need, and by the way, you're in the marketing tech space a little bit. So like, my God, like the number of MarTech things that just have exploded in the last 25 years, unbelievably stupid. I'm like, how many more snippets do we need?
The 5 years, hey son, the last 5 years, it's just been ridiculous.
It's insane. And so at a certain point, this is the wisdom part, right? At a certain point, as a leader, as a sales and marketing person, you got to go, I just need a bottle of whiskey and a pencil.
Absolutely.
Like, isn't that just good enough?
Yeah. Well, and again, and that's the mindset for the marketing piece, but on the sales piece, it's even simpler. I just need a handshake. Like,
right.
It's just, let's shake hands and agree, and we'll go figure out the details later. Like, that is still a thing. It's still a thing.
The more hands you shake, the more deals you do, the more money comes in your pocket. This seems to be like sales 101, right? And I never took a sales class ever. I'm terrible. Like, I don't know anything about sales. I know nothing about sales, but I do know that you have to shake hands. I get that concept. And so that part has worked out pretty well for me, the shaking of the hands part. Okay, so what can a man of 35 tell a man of 25 then? Because it used to be,
you got a long way to go. That's
well, but okay, maybe in the 17th century, maybe the 18th century.
But in fairness, even today, what a 35-year-old tells a 25-year-old, in my opinion, it really is, don't think you know everything.
Right. Leave
yourself room to allow yourself to learn, because as much as you think you know, there's always it's the whole, Wayne Gretzky and Michael Jordan mentality. The fear of always having somebody better than you is real. Like, that is a real thing. There's always going to be somebody coming up, and I got a piece of advice when I was a kid, the very first management job I ever had. And somebody said to me, listen, make sure you're nice to them on your way up, because you're going to see them again on your way down. And I still think that holds true no matter what industry you're in. And you're going to go up, you're going to hit a peak of some sort, regardless of where that peak is, whether it's management, ownership, leadership, it doesn't matter. Wherever that peak is, you're going to come back down to earth at some point, back down to entry level, whatever, because that's just what happens. Think about it. I've seen a person, I've known this person most of my life. I've seen a person own his own business for almost his entire life, sold the business, retired, couldn't stand retirement, went to work at Walmart as a greeter. This guy owned a multi-million-dollar company. He just wanted something to do. He was 70 years old. He just wanted to go work. So now people look at him and they're like, oh, he's just the old guy at Walmart. And he's like, if I'm thinking to myself, if you could just tap into 1 ounce of what that guy knows, I'd be a millionaire too. Like, I don't understand how people just walk by these people and not think. Now, again, culturally speaking, this is a completely different question for me, because culturally speaking, our elders and our ancestors get put on a pedestal. We will worship the ground they walk on, because we know they've been there, done that. They have something to say. They have knowledge to teach. They have wisdom. We almost inherently buy into the fact that our elders have wisdom, just because that's part of our culture. So for me, it's a lot easier than a lot of other people to look at an older person. I don't know if anybody, there's organizations out there like SCORE and things like that, where you have like these senior level mentors that'll go help you for free. I say, if you're not using situations like that, you're crazy. These people have been there, done that, know what they're doing. You have a resource available to you and it's free, and they have no problem giving you advice. Now, you don't always take it. The same thing for me. I've had mentors in my life where I don't always take what they say. I listen, I thank them. I might not do what their advice may, but I certainly will have a damn good reason why I'm not going to do what they suggest that I do. And whether the reason is internally for me or externally for pressures that they don't understand, whatever. But the reality of it is that I think that if you are embracing whatever level you're at, whether it be age or level in a company, if you are embracing that as a leader, as a leadership role, as a wisdom giving role, people will gravitate toward you. If you're willing and you're open and you're allowing it and you're talking to people, I do think people will gravitate to it. Now, again, whether they listen to you or not, I can't say, but I think there will be some pluses there.
Okay, it's interesting you brought up culture, because in some parts, not all, but some parts of African American culture, Black American culture, that reverence for the elderly and the aged is there.
Yes,
I grew up with my grandmother in my house, right? And so that is one of the things that, unfortunately, my children have been not able to experience on the one hand. But then on the other hand, both of my in-laws on either side, my wife's parents and my parents, have been able to be independent and work, to your point, well into their 70s. Okay. So been able to have those productive lives. So I've actually seen that, right? I know what that looks like. And the millionaire working at Walmart, I'm not shocked about that. Like that doesn't surprise me in the least. And even in my own life, I'm trying to set up structures right now where I can at least be interested in doing one thing or two things or three things all the way up until I can't stop doing them until I can't do them anymore, whenever that will be, which is hopefully when my mental faculties run out. The question that occurs to me, though, is, and then we're going to turn the corner and get into our last part here. But the question that occurs to me, though, as a follow-up is this. You talked about elders. I talked about elders. There's a cultural aspect to that, which is also in tension against this larger societal, cultural, Western society sort of idea, which is, and it's something we talked about again in a Shorts episode recently, I think 77 or 76, this idea of the cult of youth. Are we at the end? Finally, are we finally at the end of the cult of youth? And we finally reached the end of that sort of don't trust anyone under 30, or I'm sorry, don't trust anyone over 30 kind of mentality that really started with the baby boomer generation in the 1960s and reverberated out. And now we've got, Sam Bankman-Fried, who's easy to pick on, but Travis Kalanick or Sam Bankman-Fried or Elizabeth Holmes, who's running companies into the ground and are terrible leaders, and they're all under 30. Like if you're on the Forbes 30 under 30 list or 40 under 40 list, you're probably going to get sued for fraud. And yeah, I know. But like the majority of them don't make it. They're terrible leaders because they don't have wisdom. Like, are we at the end of the cult of youth in leadership and in business? Or do we still have a few more cycles of reverberation of that to go before we're finally done?
I think we have one. That's just my opinion. But I think I think we are at the tail end of it. But I think we have this current generation of 25-year-olds.
Yeah.
I think they still have a little bit of that mentality.
Okay.
But I think we'll see it come out of the college graduates of the next year or two, maybe three, that are going to start, like, because again, I have a daughter who's she's going into her senior year in college, and her thought process is already different than my 25 and 28-year-old.
Okay.
So I unfortunately I kind of bubble them in with that group that you're talking about. And I think that now, again, my kids grew up in our culture, so I think there is some cultural differences that they kind of still hold to, because it was just, embedded in them from a very young age.
Yeah.
But in the corporate world, I think they fall right in line with that group that you're talking about, that don't trust anybody over 30, whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that my daughter's group, and you notice I'm saying group and not generation, right? Because I don't think this is generational. Okay. I think we're talking about differences in like 5 years, 6-year groupage.
Okay.
But so I think my daughter's group coming up as they graduate, I think just in talking to her and her friends, I think she does understand that people in their 30s and 40s in the workforce hold a different kind of value. I think she does understand that, but I think it's slower than we would have liked, is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's probably Well, not, I think there's clearly been a lot of damage along the way.
Absolutely.
And I'm not, well, anyway.
Yeah, again, we could talk about certain topics for a long time.
Yeah. Well, and there's one, I know I said one last, one other thing I think that is worthwhile to point out in that little section that I read. Eleanor was talking about, one of her critiques of Willoughby was that he basically opened his mouth and let everything fall out, right? I do think that it is a mark of wisdom, even as a person who hosts a podcast and makes my living or has made my living in the past from running my mouth, quite frankly. There are times, and I even tell my kids this, where everything doesn't need to be stated. Everything doesn't need to be responded to. And sometimes that in and of itself, that silence in and of itself is an act of politeness and decorum. It may not feel like it in the moment, but it is.
I know you want to move on, but I have to say this.
Go ahead.
Exactly what you're talking about. Exactly what I just said. Here's the difference in the two groups of age groups. My son will send me a text. I will not reply. He sees me. He says, "You never replied to my text. What the heck?" And I go, "You didn't send me you didn't ask me a question. There was nothing to reply to." My daughter sends me a text. I don't reply. Never talks about it again. Like, she just realizes that it didn't require a reply. I didn't have to say anything back. You sent me a statement of knowledge that I took and accepted and said thanks. I didn't even have to say, like, good point. My son, I have to say thanks. My daughter, nothing. They both react the same way. Anyway, let's
back to the book. Back to Sense and Sensibility. Remember, I said it is the Arcturus Holdings Limited 2022 edition, published by Arcturus Publishing Limited, 2627 Bickles Yard, 151 to 153 Bermondsey Street, London. So go check them out. I don't know much about Arcturus Holdings Limited, but I do like this edition of Sense and Sensibility. It feels hefty, right? It feels solid. So we're going to move into this piece here, and it's a very short little piece that we will talk about. Colonel Brandon receives a letter, and he leaves. I won't get into why he leaves, but he leaves when he receives a letter, going back to the point that we were making earlier about the writing of letters. And so Colonel Brandon, that man of 30 and 5, now has busted out, and we open chapter 14 with the results of that leaving. From Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. The sudden termination of Colonel Brandon's visit at the park, with his steadiness in concealing its cause, filled the mind and raised the wonder of Mrs. Jennings for 2 or 3 days. She was a great wonderer, as everyone must be who takes a very lively interest in all the comings and goings of all their acquaintance. She wondered with little intermission what could be the reason of it, was sure there must be some bad news, and thought over every kind of distress that could have befallen him with a fixed determination that he should not escape them at all. Something very melancholy must be the matter, I am sure, said she. I could see it in his face. Poor man. I'm afraid his circumstances may be bad. The estate at Delaford was never reckoned more than 2,000 a year, and his brother left everything sadly involved. I do think he must have been sent for about money matters, for what else can it be? I wonder whether it is so. I would give anything to know the truth of it. Perhaps it is about Ms. Williams, and by the by, I dare say it is, because he looked so conscious when I mentioned her. Maybe she is ill in town, nothing in the world more likely, for I have a notion she is always rather sickly. I would lay any wager it is about Ms. Williams. It is not so likely that he should be distressed in his circumstances now, for he is a very prudent man, and to be sure must have cleared the estate by this time. I wonder what it can be. Maybe his sister is worse at Avignon, and has sent for him. He is setting off in such a hurry, seems very like it. Well, I wish him out of all his trouble with all my heart, and a good wife into the bargain. So wondered, so talked Mrs. Jennings, her opinion varying with every fresh conjecture, and all seemingly equally probable as they arose. Eleanor, though she felt really interested in the welfare of Colonel Brandon, could not bestow all the wonder on his going so suddenly away, which Miss Jennings was desirous of her feeling. For besides, that the circumstance did not, in her opinion, justify such lasting amazement or variety of speculation, her wonder was otherwise disposed of it. It was engrossed by the extraordinary silence of her sister and Willoughby on the subject, which they must know to be peculiarly interesting to them all. As this silence continued, every day made it appear more strange and more incompatible with the disposition of both. Why they should not openly acknowledge to her mother and herself what their constant behavior to each other had declared to have taken place, Eleanor could not imagine. She could easily conceive that marriage might not be immediately in their power, for though Willoughby was independent, there was no reason to believe him rich. His estate had been rated by Sir John at about $600 or $700 a year, but he lived at an expense to which that income could hardly be equal, and he himself had often complained of his poverty. For this strange kind of secrecy maintained by them relative to their engagement, which in fact concealed nothing at all, she could not account, and it was so wholly contradictory to their general opinions and practice that a doubt sometimes entered her mind of their really being engaged. And this doubt was enough to prevent her making any inquiry of Marianne. Nothing could be more expressive of attachment to them all than Willoughby's behavior. To Marianne, it had all the distinguishing tenderness which a lover's heart could give, and to the rest of the family, it was the affectionate attention of a son and a brother. The cottage seemed to be considered and loved by him as his home. Many more of his hours were spent there than at Allenham, and if no general engagement collected them at the park, the exercise of which called him out in the morning was almost certain of ending there, where the rest of the day was spent by himself at the side of Marianne and by his favorite pointer at her feet. Why did Colonel Brandon leave? What was he running up and jumping about? Oh my gosh, there's going to be all this speculation. We're going to make up stories in our head because we couldn't wring out from the person the truth of the matter that we wanted. Mrs. Jennings stands in as an avatar for the modern era. Mrs. Jennings would have really liked Facebook and Twitter. We talk a lot about social media on this platform, but she would have loved that. Turns out that that gossip is no new thing under the sun, and making up stories in our heads, and then elaborating on them as truth, particularly objective truth, is not that new. In that little clip, we do see some faint beginning parallels in the first part of Sense and Sensibility to Shakespeare's King Lear, which we covered in episode number 56. And if you recall, King Lear is the story of the king, Lear, who has three daughters, Regan, Cordelia, and Goneril, and he divides up the kingdom among them. Sense and Sensibility is King Lear in reverse, with Mrs. Dashwood would be cast in the role of King Lear, and then of course Marianne, Eleanor, and Margaret in the role of the three sisters. Now that is a feminist critique of Sense and Sensibility, but Jane Austen's writing, as we made the point in Persuasion, and I feel it needs to be made here, Jane Austen's writing defies feminism. It defies easy categorization, easy pigeonholing, right? Austen was consumed, and we've already mentioned this, with revealing the tyranny of the small things, as we saw in that little piece there. Mrs. Jennings running around creating towers of truth in her head. Eleanor critiquing Willoughby and his poverty, and of course Willoughby claiming poverty in order to lure in Marianne, and of course Marianne allowing herself to be lured. She was also consumed, Austen was, with presenting and representing social hierarchical structures and the nature of the struggle that the classes were having in England to maintain those structures. They weren't, as in our modern era, with our elites trying to pull up the structures. And by the way, the characters in Jane Austen's novels were very often middle class, what we would call middle class. They were trying to maintain middle class decorum. They were trying to maintain middle class structure. They were trying to maintain a middle class way of civilization, right? In order to maintain society. There is a weird modern belief, and I heard this recently, that in transcending the system, or if you're not able to transcend the system, that you are in, and we talked a little bit about this just now. If you're not able to transcend the system that you are unfortunately happen to be born in, then you can rebel against it and you can destroy it. We have this idea now as moderns. But the fact of the matter is, and Austen's very, very real about this, as most genuinely great authors are, Steinbeck, Hemingway, Faulkner, Shakespeare, even the Greeks. The tragedy of human hierarchies and the tragedy of human systems, and Austen demonstrates this just in this little clip in Sensibility, the tragedy of all this is that you're going to operate in some kind of system, and that the rules in that system were made for you before you were born. And you may not like it, and you may have a thought about it, but you're going to serve the system. As Bob Dylan said back in the day, I don't care whether you're the Pope in Rome or the homeless man on the street in San Francisco, you're going to serve somebody or something. You might want to choose what you're going to serve, but you're going to serve. There's no such thing as floating transcendently above the system, above the thing. And Austen tries to ground that idea in Sense and Sensibility. So, Tom, there's this idea, and we haven't really talked about it on the podcast, you and I have not, this idea of hierarchies, right? There's the men, there's the women, there's who's getting what money, there's, who's inheriting what, who's poor, who's rich. It's kind of gauche for us to talk about that. But we do care very much about it, and we do care very much about hierarchies. And I used to tell my kids, or I've recently begun in the last couple of years telling my kids, if you want to move to the top of a dominance hierarchy, be the meanest dog on the block, basically. That's what you have to be in order to move to the top of a dominance hierarchy. But very often people don't get that message, and leaders really hate to be seen in that mode. They like to be seen in the sort of Steve Jobs technocratic kind of, V-neck, whatever, not V-neck, a turtleneck, black turtleneck sort of mode. But I'm getting a sense there's a shift that's happening in the zeitgeist. I mean, for God's sakes, I just saw recently that Mark Zuckerberg was at a Brazilian jiu-jitsu tournament. So, right. So what's happening with hierarchies? I mean, it's not like we're throwing them out, right? So how do leaders navigate hierarchies? How do they operate in hierarchies that aren't really made for them? And by the way, this is a challenge for all of us, because we were all born into this world and we have to operate inside of the system.
Yeah, this was a good one for me too. Like when I started thinking about, and as you were reading the section of the book and thinking about, so there's a little bit of that, and we saw this a little bit in the 2008 crash when there was just a boatload of layoffs, right? People were getting laid off left and right, and you basically had there was a huge surge of people starting their own companies because of it, right? Like it was so in other words, I didn't like the way that hierarchy treated me. I'm just going to go create my own. I'm just going to make my own hierarchy, but the thing that I think people forget is exactly what you're talking about. Even if I start my own company, I own my own company, I start it, I build it, I'm the top dog in my hierarchy, there's still a bigger hierarchy out there that I still feed into that machine, right? So unless you are the Forbes 100, when it comes to a corporate sense or a ownership sense of a company, unless you are the Forbes 100, you are being dictated to by some sort of something above you, right? In the tech world, it's Apple or Google. In the retail world, it's Amazon, whatever, right? Unless you are one of those top companies. If you try to look at it from a different, if you try to separate that out and look at it from a different perspective, even there's hierarchies even in our own families, right? Again, we were talking about our elders and cultural, advances to the elders. And now in today's world, you do have family members that feel like they don't belong in that hierarchy and that they are trying to reinvent themselves or move themselves out of that firing line, and they're trying to put themselves in a different firing line. And I'm trying to be pretty generic here, but I think and I've said this on this podcast more than once, I think the true key here is, regardless of whether you're trying to build your own hierarchy, falling within the current one, moving, manipulate, whatever, it's really about how you treat yourself, how you treat your peers, and how you are allowing other people to treat yourself. Because it is entirely up to you. Like, you dictate how people treat you. You dictate how you treat other people. You are the only one that you have 100% control over, right? Yep. If there's a book by Rick Pitino called Success is a Choice. He talks about a lot of on how your decision-making process will directly impact your success, not somebody else, not the government, not some big company you work for. You yourself will make decisions that will impact your own success. And I'm going to give you an example of something real quick so as I was reading this book, one of my sons at the time was about 12 years old. And something that I read the night before really impacted me. So him and I were talking about it, and I was like, yeah, did you really, did you get this? Like, you're 12 years old. You have your whole life ahead of you. Every decision you make could impact your success. Like, you are in control. And I'm like trying to beat this into his head. And he goes, no, I'm not.
No, yeah.
What do you mean? He goes, I got to go to school today. He's like, I have to go to school. And I go, no, but that's the brilliance of this. I go, it's your choice to go to school. He goes, okay, so I can stay home? I go, yeah. I go, but then you have to deal with the consequences, like, of me. And he goes, well, then I have to go to school because I don't want to go. No. The choice is stay home or go to school. You choose to go to school because you don't want to deal with the consequences. This is a similar kind of argument, or not argument. This is a similar kind of philosophy here. It's still your choice on whether or not you have to operate within the hierarchy or not. We choose to because we don't want the consequences that are outside of that world. We tend to, and I don't want to say we fall in line, because we try to make our own waves. We try to ripple it. People try. But like I said, unless you're the Forbes 100, they are the ones really creating that hierarchy. And then everybody else just kind of falls in a line. And you could try to disrupt them. And I'm sure the Forbes 100 will love the fact that somebody new dips into that. Probably not. I'm just kidding. But, because they love having the 100 be the same for the last 10 years or whatever. They thrive on that because they're the ones dictating those hierarchies in the corporate world. Outside of the corporate world, I think there's way too many opportunities to talk about. This is way too much. It's too big of a subject. But I think
you're going to, like you said, I like that you talked about consequences, right? Because one of the points I've made on this podcast as well is that we as leaders sometimes refuse to engage in consequentialist thinking. We refuse to acknowledge that there will be a consequence for this thing. We sort of want to pretend or want to act as if we can make decisions or take actions or serve hierarchies in a vacuum. And I wish, my genuine wish for leaders is that they would say to their followers, we're in this hierarchy. There are consequences for being in this hierarchy. This is what they are. Are you in or out?
Love it or leave it.
Are you in or out? Right.
Yeah.
And you don't have to do it in a direct way that makes everybody feel uncomfortable, that's confrontational. You can be winsome, and you can be introverted, and you can do all these. Okay, you can do all those things. Deliver it however the hell you want to deliver it, but deliver that message. Deliver the message that, listen, this thing that we're doing here, you talked about a small business that was started in 2008. Okay, let's go with that. This small business that we started in 2008 has a hierarchy. I founded it. I stay up late at night thinking about it. You all collect a salary. If you want to, at a certain point, start thinking about the things I'm thinking about as the owner of this business, stop collecting a salary and walk with me down this path.
Right.
That's the honest statement that has to be made.
Right.
if I'm a manager in not one of the Forbes 100, but if I'm in a manager in one of the Forbes 10,000 businesses, right, that serve the Forbes 100, by the way, that are on the supply chain, if I'm a manager leader inside of those structures, my role is to say to those individuals, look, we have all agreed by dint of our voting with our feet and collecting a paycheck to be here. We voted with our feet. That is the decision we made. There are consequences to that decision. There's monetary consequences, there's financial consequences, there's economic consequences, there's personnel consequences. These are all of the plethora of consequences that exist for us. If we want to experience different ones, we have to make different decisions. And by the way, we have to do this actively and intentionally, which is why my book is called Intentional Leadership, right? Because if we're not doing that with our brain on and we're doing it with our brain off, then we're engaged in we're engaged in story building structure like Mrs. Jennings. Right, we're building structures of stories about reality that may have absolutely nothing to do with the objective thing that's out there.
Right.
I wish more leaders were focused in that kind of way, because I think then leadership becomes less tyrannical and it becomes more collaborative, but in a real kind of way.
There's a very simple explanation as to why they're not.
Okay, what's the simple explanation?
It's scary.
And with that,
they're scared to do it.
Yeah, no, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. It is scary. It's scary to kind of say that, because well, there's consequences to saying that, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. There's consequences to acknowledging the hierarchy. There's consequences to, well, and you know what? Maybe it's a weird thing. So I transitioned from being in a higher education hierarchy to owning my own thing to now I'm in a different hierarchy doing something else. I'm at the bottom of a dominance hierarchy again right now on another project. And so one of the things that I've become better at in the course of my career is recognizing where those hierarchical structures are, really figuring out how the pyramid is working fairly quickly, and making a decision fairly quickly of, yes, I want to be in, or no, I don't. And the faster that I can make that decision intuitively, even before I go and interview for a position, or even before I go and have a meeting, or even before I go, right? And trust me, there's times when I look at a structure and I go, and I've gotten this feedback from people, well, you don't really know everything that's in the structure. No, I don't. But I also don't know everything that goes on in like a prison. I don't want to go there.
I don't want to know. Yeah.
I don't want to know. I don't feel compelled to have to know everything that goes on inside of a structure to know that I don't want to be part of it. And if I have multiple choices for multiple hierarchies that I could be engaged in, why would I pick one that doesn't work for me? Right? Like you talked about the multimillionaire who's now the greeter at Walmart. I have zero interest in being a greeter at Walmart. Now, I'm not saying that that's not something that, if circumstances or whatever, and I had to take it, I would take it. Sure. Okay. I'll take it. Who knows? Right. And if I had to use an old school word, my druthers, I'm going to do the scary thing of picking a hierarchy that matches closer my personality, and Walmart doesn't match my personality. It's purely then it's a purely utilitarian choice at that point. Right. And that's scary in its own kind of way, but weirdly enough, it's less scary than just sort of being transparent and picking the hierarchy intentionally with your eyes wide open. All right. Well, how do we stay on the path then? Let's wrap this sucker up. Let's bring this sucker home. How do we stay on the path, Tom? What?
Well, I think the simplest answer to this, I try to, sometimes I think I oversimplify things, but yeah. But I think realistically, if you find the path that's right for you, this question isn't even a question. It just becomes second nature, right?
Yeah.
If the path is right, there's no effort that you have to use or leverage to stay, quote unquote, stay on the path. If you find yourself having to overwork to really drive to stay on that same path, maybe you need to take a closer look at the path. Maybe you need to actually look and say, am I really on the right path? Or am I just doing, or am I going through the motions because it's expected of me? Am I going through the motions because it's financially advantageous, but not necessarily what I truly want? There's validity behind, you've all heard the statement, if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. That is really true. I love sales and marketing. I never think of anything that I do as real work. Believe me, I flipped burgers as a kid. You know what I mean? Like that was work. That was real work.
Tom smelled like grease from the fryer back in the day.
Terrible. Or I should say I flipped. I spun pizzas. I actually work for a pizza place, so
okay.
I flip pizzas. But same rule, right?
Same thing, right? Yeah.
I wasn't so in love with it that it was so easy to do. I found the place where I feel like I fit, and for me to stay on the path is not difficult. There's not a lot of effort that I have to put into. Now, I just want to be clear here. Do not mistake that statement for me thinking that I don't have anything that's difficult to do. Right. I have lots of tasks that are hard and that I don't always enjoy. There are certain parts and components that I have to convince myself to get up in the morning for, and blah, blah, blah. There's certain parts, but overall, the huge overall sprawling piece of this landscape, I find it fascinating and fun and intriguing, and I love it. I love being elbow deep into this stuff. I love solving problems that are based on sales and marketing. I love it. Even in my personal life, I now at, we were joking around being on the 50 under 50 or whatever. I turned 49 this month. Okay. I now find myself in a position in my personal life that I don't feel like I have to put a lot of effort into being happy. I really don't. I love being where I am in my personal life. I finally feel like I'm on that path that doesn't take a lot of effort to stay on. Like, so it's, and I remember, as now, and it's so funny too, because I always tell people, if it wasn't for hindsight, I'd be blind, right? Because hindsight is always 20/20. Mm-hmm. That's actually not true. You can look at your past and still look at it through fogged glasses, thinking that I woulda, shoulda, coulda, had whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily the case if you're looking through it with clear lenses, saying, I made that decision because of X, and I did it, and it ended up this way, and I'm now on the right path, so I'm okay. I'm okay with that decision, right? Like, so it's, I just find that staying on the path should not be as much work as people think it is. I just don't think it. I think if you're putting in time and effort and hammering yourself every day and constantly trying to, that you might be on the wrong path. You might want to do some soul searching here. Like,
that is an excellent point. Yes. I would add to it, in order to determine if you're on the right path or not, you want to probably send yourself a personal letter. Like that old song back in the day, take a letter, Maria.
Yeah, right.
Except that one he was addressing to his wife about not coming back home. So maybe the lyrics don't really apply necessarily for leaders, but take time to write down what you're thinking about the path you're on. Get real close to your core values of politeness and decorum. Heck, sometimes it starts with being polite even to yourself, treating yourself as if you are a person who's worthwhile to be polite to, understand that all of your experiences bring something to the table, whether you're 49 or 39 or 29, your experiences bring something to the table. They do have some value. They do have some merit. They have some weight. Don't dismiss that, but also don't overweigh it.
I've said that on this podcast with you, Hassan.
Yeah,
that you should be able to learn from anybody.
Anybody.
It doesn't matter what age they are. They've got something to teach you. They really do.
And you should be able to learn from yourself and your experiences, no matter what age you're bringing those experiences from. And then, of course, understand that you live in a world of systems. I live in a world of systems. There's absolutely zero way out of it. So choose, as the knight said in Indiana Jones, down there with the Holy Grail cup, choose wisely. And with that, I'd like to thank Tom Libby for joining us today on the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast.
You're welcome, my son.
And this is us signing off. Listen and subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all the major podcast players that you listen to podcasts on, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and even Spotify. And please leave a 5-star review if you like the show. We need those reviews to grow, and it's the easiest way to make sure that this show gets into the ears of the leaders who need to hear it. And of course, tell all your friends. If you want to get started on the leadership path, HSCT Publishing's products and services can help your team do that. Check out our training webinars, coaching services, and more at leadershiptoolbox.us. We also have a video-based subscription service, that's software as a service, that can help your team become better at the individual level. 60 modules and over 100 hours of video and written content for you at LeadingKeys.com. That's LeadingKeys.com. We've also got books that will help you and your team grow. Pick up a copy today of My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 essays on disrupting your workplace by disrupting your boss, and subscribe to the Little Red podcast I launched earlier this year with the same name as that Little Red book. My most recent book is 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership. Co-written with contributions from Bradley Madigan, this is the book for right now that was written for leaders right now. Pick up a copy by heading over to 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. That's 12rulesleadersbook.com/now. You pay for shipping, and you'll get a copy of my second book as well. Finally, you can get all these books in paperback, hardcover, or as ebooks on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, and any other place online you order books. Finally, HSCT Publishing is on YouTube. Like and subscribe to the video version of the Leadership Lessons for the Great Books podcast on the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube. Just search for HSCT Publishing and hit the subscribe button. You'll get our weekly video updates, which is the video version of this podcast. And, of course, you're going to want to subscribe to my other podcast. That's right, I do more than one. The Hey Sansorels Presents audio experience, where I talk more casually with a broader range of people about all matters that matter in the world today, from arts all the way to analytics. All right, that's it for me.